He had nothing. 16-year-old Cale Morrison pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his shoulders, though it did little to ward off the cold that had settled deep in his bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He had nothing. Nothing. No family. His mother dead 3 years now, his father a ghost who'd vanished into a bottle long before that. No home. The last foster family had made it clear he wasn't welcome after he'd turned 16. No identity, just a nameless boy who didn't belong anywhere to anyone. The cave he'd found 6 months ago had become his entire world. Hidden deep in the rocky mountain wilderness, it was little more than a crack in the granite face, but it was his. The only thing that was truly his. He'd learned to survive off the land, trapping rabbits, fishing in the icy streams, gathering what edible plants he could find. Some days he succeeded. Others he went hungry. Today was one of the hungry days. Cale crouched by the small fire he'd built at the cave's mouth, watching the last of his jerky disappear into his empty stomach. The flames danced weakly as if they too were giving up hope. He stared into them, seeing nothing but darkness ahead. Winter was coming, and he wasn't sure he'd survive it. Maybe he didn't want to. What's the point, he thought, the familiar weight of despair settling over him like a blanket. Who would even know if I just stopped trying? The answer was simple. No one. He was nothing, had nothing, was nothing. 3 days later, hunger drove Cale down to Willow Creek, his stomach gnawing at itself like a trapped animal. He'd set snares along the rabbit trails, but they'd come up empty again. The creek was his last hope. Sometimes he could catch trout with his bare hands if he was patient enough. He was crouched motionless by the water's edge, waiting for a fish to venture into the shallows, when he heard it, a soft whimper, barely audible over the babbling water. Cale froze. It sounded human. Following the sound, he pushed through a tangle of willows and found her, a girl about his age, lying unconscious on the rocky bank. Her long black hair was matted with blood, and her left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. She wore buckskin clothing decorated with intricate beadwork, and her features marked her as Native American. For a moment, Cale just stared. He'd seen members of the local Blackfoot tribe from a distance, but never this close. Never like this. She was dying. He could walk away, should walk away. He had enough problems without taking on someone else's. But as he turned to leave, she stirred, dark eyes fluttering open to meet his. Even through her pain, he saw the terror there, not of death, but of him. She tried to crawl backward, whimpering in her native tongue. "I won't hurt you," Cale said softly, raising his hands to show they were empty. "You're hurt bad." She didn't understand his words, but something in his tone made her stop trying to flee. They stared at each other across the space between worlds, two lost souls finding each other in the wilderness. Cale made his choice. Getting her back to the cave nearly killed them both. The girl, he guessed her name was something he couldn't pronounce from the way she whispered to herself, had a broken leg and a severe head wound. She drifted in and out of consciousness as he half carried, half dragged her up the mountain. By the time they reached his sanctuary, Cale was exhausted and she was burning with fever. For 3 days, he tended her with a desperation he didn't understand. He'd never cared for another person before, had never been cared for really. But something about her vulnerability called to his own. He used what little medical knowledge he'd gleaned from library books, setting her leg with splints made from pine branches and strips torn from his only spare shirt. He fed her water drop by drop when she was unconscious, broth made from boiled rabbit bones when she could manage it. He kept the fire burning constantly, using precious firewood to keep her warm. On the 4th day, her fever broke. She woke to find him sitting across the small cave, stirring a pot of thin stew. Their eyes met, and this time there was no fear in hers, only curiosity and something that might have been gratitude. "Ayana," she said softly, pressing a hand to her chest. "Kale," he replied, mimicking her gesture. It was the beginning of understanding. Over the following weeks they learned to communicate in a language deeper than words. Ayana, which Kale learned meant eternal blossom, taught him basic signs and phrases in Blackfoot. He shared his knowledge of the mountain, showing her the safe paths and hidden water sources from within the cave. She was healing faster than he'd expected, though she still couldn't put weight on her leg. During the long hours when she rested, Kale found himself talking, really talking, for the first time in years. He told her about his mother's death, about the foster homes, about the crushing loneliness that had driven him to this isolated place. Ayana listened with dark, intelligent eyes, occasionally reaching out to touch his hand when the pain in his voice became too much. She spoke too, her voice musical even when he couldn't understand the words. He sensed she was telling him her own story about family, about belonging to something larger than herself. Things Kale had never known. One evening, as they shared a meal of roasted fish, Ayana touched the leather cord around his neck. Kale tensed. He'd forgotten he was wearing it. At the end of the cord hung a small carved pendant, the only thing his mother had left him. It was made of dark wood, carved in an intricate pattern he'd never understood. Ayana's eyes widened when she saw it, and she spoke rapidly in Blackfoot, pointing at the pendant and then at herself. "I don't understand," Kale said, but something in her excitement made his heart race. She touched the pendant gently, then pressed her hand to her own chest, speaking a single word over and over, Nitsipoisktsini, Nitsipoisktsini. Family, they came at dawn. Kale woke to the sound of horses and voices outside the cave. He grabbed his hunting knife, a pitiful weapon against what sounded like a war party, and moved to shield Ayana, who was struggling to sit up. "Ayana." The voice that echoed from outside was deep and commanding. "Ayana, Itapiakai." Ayana's face lit up with joy and relief. She called back in rapid Blackfoot, then turned to Kale with urgent gestures, trying to explain. "Your people," he said, understanding. "They've come for you." But when the warriors entered the cave, their faces were thunderous with rage. The leader, a tall man with gray-streaked hair and war paint across his cheeks, took one look at Kale and drew his tomahawk. "Napicone," he snarled. "White dog, what have you done to her?" "No." Ayana struggled to her feet, positioning herself between Kale and her kinsmen. She spoke rapidly, gesturing to her splinted leg, to the carefully tended fire, to the evidence of Kale's care. The tension in the cave was thick enough to cut. Kale could see the doubt in the warriors' eyes. They wanted to believe he'd harmed her, that he was the enemy they expected him to be. But Ayana kept talking, her voice growing stronger and more insistent. Slowly, Kale began to pick out words he recognized. Saved, gentle. Brother, the leader who Kale guessed was her father, listened with a stony expression. When Ayana finished, he studied Kale for a long moment, then spoke in halting English. "She says you saved her life, fed her, cared for her." His voice was heavy with skepticism. "Why?" Kale met his gaze steadily. "Because she needed help. White men do not help our people. This one did." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the arrival of another warrior, this one riding hard and covered in dust. He spoke urgently to the leader in Blackfoot, and Kale watched the man's face grow grim. "What is it?" Kale asked, though he wasn't sure anyone would answer. The leader, Ayana's father, Chief Black Wolf, studied him for another moment, then seemed to make a decision. "Soldiers come," he said in English. "Many soldiers. They say we have stolen cattle, killed settlers. They say we must leave our lands or face war." Cale felt his stomach drop. He'd heard the rumors in town before he'd fled to the mountains. Tensions between the territorial cavalry and the local tribes had been escalating for months. Settlers wanted the fertile valley land, and they were putting pressure on the military to remove the Indian problem. "Have you?" Cale asked quietly. "Stolen cattle, killed settlers." Black Wolf's eyes flashed dangerously, but Ayana spoke up, her voice sad. Even without understanding all her words, Cale caught her meaning. "No, we have done nothing." "Then why are they coming?" "Because they want our land," Black Wolf said simply, "and we are in the way." The weight of the situation settled over them all. This wasn't just about Ayana anymore. This was about war, about survival, about two peoples who couldn't seem to coexist. "Where will you go?" Cale asked. "We will not go," Black Wolf said firmly. "This is our land. Our ancestors are buried here. We will fight." "And you'll die," Cale said bluntly. "All of you. The cavalry has repeating rifles, cannons. How many warriors do you have? 50? 100? They'll bring 300 soldiers." The silence that followed was heavy with truth. Everyone in the cave knew Cale was right, but knowing and accepting were different things. "Let me go to them," Cale said suddenly. Every eye in the cave turned to him. Black Wolf looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "The soldiers," Cale explained. "Let me go to them. I can tell them the truth, that you haven't done anything wrong. Maybe I can prevent this war." "You are one boy," Black Wolf said dismissively. "Why would they listen to you?" "Because I'm white," Cale said simply. "They'll listen to me in a way they won't listen to you. And maybe there's another way." Ayana spoke up, her voice urgent. Cale caught fragments, something about trust, about the pendant around his neck, about family. Black Wolf's expression changed, becoming thoughtful. He spoke to his daughter at length, then turned back to Cale. "She says you are different, that you have the heart of our people, though you were born to another race." He paused, studying Cale's face. "She says the spirits brought you to save her for a reason." "Maybe they did," Cale said, though he'd never believed in spirits or fate or any of it. "Will you let me try?" The debate that followed was intense, conducted mostly in Blackfoot with occasional translations for Cale's benefit. Some of the warriors wanted to kill him on principle. Others argued for immediate flight. A few sided with the idea of letting him attempt diplomacy. In the end, it was Ayana who settled the matter. She struggled to her feet, supporting herself against the cave wall, and spoke with quiet authority. When she finished, Black Wolf nodded slowly. "She says if you are willing to risk your life for people who are not your blood, then you have already proven yourself worthy of trust." He met Cale's eyes. "But if you betray us, if this is some white man's trick, I will hunt you to the ends of the earth." "Understood," Cale said. The cavalry camp was a sprawling collection of tents and picket lines 3 miles from the tribal village. Cale approached slowly, his hands visible and empty, trying to project peaceful intentions. The sentries spotted him long before he reached the perimeter. By the time he walked into camp, a crowd had gathered, including the commanding officer, a stern-faced colonel with silver hair and hard eyes. "Son, what are you doing out here?" the colonel asked. "This is a military operation. Civilians need to stay clear." "I need to talk to you, sir," Cale said respectfully, "about the Blackfoot tribe you're planning to engage." The colonel's expression darkened. "You know something about those savages? Did they capture you, threaten you?" "No, sir, they saved my life." Cale took a breath. "And I think you're about to make a terrible mistake." The story poured out of him, how he'd found Ayana, how her people had shown mercy to a stranger, how they were peaceful people being blamed for crimes they hadn't committed. The colonel listened with growing skepticism. "Boy, I've got reports of stolen cattle, burned homesteads, settlers killed and scalped. You telling me those redskins are innocent as lambs?" "I'm telling you someone else is doing those things," Cale said firmly. "Maybe renegades from another tribe, maybe white men trying to start a war, but not Chief Black Wolf's people. And why should I believe the word of some half-wild mountain boy over my own scouts?" It was a fair question, and Cale didn't have a good answer. He was nobody, a homeless orphan with no credibility, no authority, no reason to be trusted, but he had to try. "Because if you attack that village, you'll be murdering innocent people," he said quietly. "Women and children who never hurt anyone, and that'll be on your conscience for the rest of your life." The colonel stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "Son, I appreciate your concern, but I have orders. These Indians have 3 hours to clear out of the valley. If they are still there after that, we're going in." Cale felt his heart sink. He'd failed. The war was going to happen, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Cale rode back to the tribal village with death in his heart. He'd borrowed a horse from the cavalry. The colonel had at least been willing to let him carry the ultimatum rather than sending soldiers who might be shot on sight. The village was preparing for war when he arrived. Warriors painted their faces and sharpened their weapons. Women and children were being moved to defensive positions. Everyone moved with the grim efficiency of people who knew they were about to die. Chief Black Wolf met him at the edge of the village. "Well, 3 hours," Cale said heavily. "I couldn't convince them. I'm sorry." Black Wolf nodded as if he'd expected no less. "You tried. That is more than any white man has done for us before." "There has to be another way," Cale said desperately. "What if? What if some of the warriors came with me, not to surrender but to talk? If the colonel could see that you're reasonable people, he will see what he wishes to see," Black Wolf said sadly. "The Napicon have already decided we are savages. Nothing we say will change that." "Then at least let me stay," Cale said. "Let me fight with you." Black Wolf looked at him with something that might have been respect. "You would die for people who are not your blood." "They're more my family than anyone else has ever been," Cale said simply. It was the truth. These people, Ayana, her father, even the warriors who had wanted to kill him, had shown him more acceptance in a few weeks than he'd found in 16 years of living among his own race. Black Wolf was quiet for a long moment, then called out in Blackfoot. An elderly woman emerged from one of the lodges, her face lined with age and wisdom. She walked slowly to where Cale sat on his borrowed horse, studying him with sharp eyes. She spoke to Black Wolf, who translated. "Grandmother Willow wants to see your pendant." Cale pulled the leather cord over his head and handed it to her. The old woman examined the carved piece carefully, turning it over in her weathered hands. As she did, her eyes grew wide. She began speaking rapidly, her voice excited and urgent. Other tribal members gathered around, and soon there was a crowd surrounding Cale, all talking at once. "What is it?" Cale asked, confused by the commotion. Black Wolf held up a hand for silence, then looked up at Cale with an expression of wonder. "Where did you get this pendant?" "It was my mother's," Cale said. "The only thing she left me." "What was her name?" "Sarah Morrison." "Well, Sarah Morrison when she died. I don't know what her name was before." Grandmother Willow spoke again, and this time Black Wolf's face went pale. "Okyeki," he whispered. "Dancing moon." The story came out in pieces, translated by Black Wolf and Ayana. filled in by Grandmother Willow and other elders who remembered. 20 years ago, a young Blackfoot woman named Dancing Moon had been taken during a cavalry raid on their winter camp. She'd been barely 17, newly married, and 3 months pregnant. Her husband had been killed trying to protect her, and she'd been presumed dead when no trace of her was found. But she hadn't died. Somehow she'd survived, been taken in by white settlers perhaps, or found by travelers. She'd lived long enough to give birth to her son and to keep the pendant that marked her as one of the people. "Your mother," Black Wolf said quietly, "was my sister." The words hit Cale like a physical blow. He slid off his horse, legs suddenly unsteady. "That's impossible," he whispered. "The pendant does not lie," Grandmother Willow said in halting English. "It was carved by my own hands for Dancing Moon on her wedding day. I know every line, every curve." Cale stared at the faces surrounding him, faces that suddenly seemed familiar, as if he were looking at distorted reflections of himself in still water. The shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw, the color of his skin that had always been a shade darker than other white children. He wasn't white, not fully, he was both and neither, a child of two worlds who had never belonged to either. "That means," he began, the implications crashing over him. "It means you are Nitsipoisk-Sini," Ayana said softly. "Family, it means you have come home." Black Wolf stepped forward and placed his hands on Cale's shoulders. "It means you are my nephew, Dancing Moon's son, a child of the people who was lost and has found his way back to us." Around them, the tribal members began to murmur in awe. The spirits had indeed brought Cale to save Ayana, not as a stranger but as a lost child of the tribe returning home. But even as Cale's heart swelled with a belonging he'd never known, the sound of distant bugles reminded them all that their reunion was about to be cut short. The cavalry was coming. "You can stop this," Black Wolf said urgently. "You are one of us, but you are also one of them. Go back to the soldiers. Tell them who you are, make them understand." But Cale was shaking his head before his uncle finished speaking. "It won't matter. The colonel doesn't care about family connections or ancient rites. He has orders to clear the valley, and that's what he'll do." "Then we fight," one of the warriors said grimly. "And die," Cale replied. "All of us." The sound of marching feet was growing closer. Soon the cavalry would crest the ridge overlooking the village, and then there would be no more time for talk. Cale closed his eyes, feeling the weight of two worlds pressing down on him. He'd spent his whole life belonging to neither, and now he had a chance to belong to both if he could find a way to bridge the gap between them. When he opened his eyes, he had an idea. A desperate, probably suicidal idea, but an idea nonetheless. "Give me a white flag," he said, "and get everyone ready to run." "What are you planning?" Ayana asked, though she was already limping toward her horse. "Something stupid," Cale admitted, "but maybe stupid enough to work." Cale rode out to meet the cavalry column alone, a strip of white cloth tied to a willow branch held high above his head. The soldiers had formed a battle line on the ridge, and he could see the colonel sitting his horse in the center, field glasses trained on the village below. "Colonel," Cale called out as he approached, "I need to talk to you." The officer lowered his glasses, frowning. "Son, I told you to stay out of this. You're going to get yourself killed." "Maybe," Cale said, "but before you attack that village, there's something you need to know." He told the colonel about the pendant, about his mother, about the discovery of his heritage. The officer listened with growing disbelief. "You're telling me you're part Indian," he said skeptically. "I'm telling you those people down there are my family," Cale said firmly, "and I'm asking you not to kill them." "Orders are orders, son. I'm sorry, but—" "Then I have a proposition," Cale interrupted. Give me 24 hours. Let me ride to the territorial capital. Let me talk to the governor, tell him what I've learned about who's really been raiding the settlements. The governor isn't going to listen to a boy. He might listen to this boy, Cale said, pulling out a folded paper from his jacket, especially when I tell him I have proof that the raids are being carried out by a gang of white men dressed as Indians, trying to start a war so they can claim tribal lands. It wasn't entirely true. Cale didn't have proof, just suspicions and the word of his newfound family. But he'd learned enough about politics and greed in his 16 years to know how these things usually worked. The colonel studied the paper, actually just a letter Cale had written to himself, but official-looking enough in the dim light. 24 hours, 24 hours. If I can't bring back orders to stand down, you can attack with my blessing. And what's to stop me from just attacking now and finishing this business? Cale met his eyes steadily. The fact that if you massacre innocent people, I'll make sure everyone from here to Washington knows about it. And they'll know you had a chance to verify the truth and chose murder instead. It was a bluff, but a good one. The colonel was clearly torn between his orders and his conscience. Finally, he nodded. 24 hours, but if you're not back by sunset tomorrow, we're going in. Cale never had to make that desperate ride to the territorial capital. That afternoon, a patrol brought in 3 white men who'd been caught red-handed trying to steal cattle while dressed in war paint and feathers. Under questioning, they confessed to the raids that had been blamed on the Blackfoot tribe. The crisis was over, but for Cale, a new life was just beginning. Chief Black Wolf offered him a place in the tribe, not as an adopted member, but as a son returning home. Cale accepted, though he would spend his time moving between both worlds, serving as a translator and mediator between his people and the white settlements. Ayanna recovered fully from her injuries, and as the seasons turned, the bond that had formed between them in the cave deepened into something more. On the day he turned 18, Cale asked her father for permission to marry her, and the old chief smiled as he gave his blessing. "You have traveled far to find your way home," Black Wolf said, "but the spirits knew where you belonged all along." Cale touched the pendant at his throat, his mother's pendant, his birthright, the key that had unlocked his true identity. He thought of Sarah Morrison, who had been Dancing Moon, who had kept this piece of her heritage even in a world that would have destroyed her for it. She had given him more than just life. She had given him the means to find his way back to where he belonged. That night, as he sat by the fire with Ayanna's head on his shoulder and his uncle telling stories of ancestors and heroes, Cale Morrison, who had been nothing and nobody, realized he was finally, truly home. He was no longer lost between worlds. He had become the bridge between them. And for the first time in his life, that was enough.